Welcome back to a chilling night of stories. I'm a police officer in a small town in Texas, and I have some terrifying stories to tell. For those that haven't heard my other tales, Mineral Wells is a small town in Texas where I've been working for 5 years as a police officer. It's located somewhere north of interesting and south of scary as shit, where the citizens are strange, the events are stranger, and the past is never past. Story 1. Back at my apartment, I sat alone underneath the single light illuminating my small dining table, head in my hands. I could still see the young girl's hollow eyes staring blankly back at me. I shuddered, reaching into the satchel on the table and slowly pulling out the 5 folders I had retrieved from the filing cabinet at the Norwood. They were legal-sized, olive in color, and only slightly faded. They looked no different from any other folder you might come across at your office. What they signified, however, was something much more sinister and damning. I reached for one, but couldn't bring myself to open it. I stared at them for a while before putting them back in the satchel and closing the flap. I was exhausted and terrified, and I had had enough, at least for the night. In the morning, I still couldn't bring myself to look at them. Something had happened to me the night before, the nature of which is hard to explain, but I'll try. I felt dull, not as in uninteresting, but as if the bright and polished parts of me had been scratched off or rubbed away, leaving only raw and faded parts behind. Is that what depression feels like? I think it's easy to pretend you know how you would react if you ever came face to face with a true ghost or spirit. I think what we see in movies and on television desensitizes us to how it would really feel if we experienced it ourselves. That type of terror is not something the mind can manage on its own, I'll tell you that. The body takes over. Instinct, perhaps, something primal woven into our DNA. It leaves you changed. Left me changed anyway. It was probably almost a week before I mustered the courage to find out what was inside those folders. The first file appeared to be the file for a 7-year-old boy from South Carolina admitted for the treatment of his leukemia, referred to only as Charlie. I flipped through the pages until I found one with a surgical notes heading, entitled, Replantation of Severed Limb of Minor Child. It went on to describe in detail a surgical procedure with the purpose of reattaching the subject's severed hand? The words were technical in nature, and I didn't understand some of them. Preparation of the stump included the shortening of both bones by 1 cm. Repair of the radial artery, ulnar nerve, and median nerve was attempted along with 2 veins, one on the volar aspect and one on the dorsum. I skipped over to the next page and found at the bottom under surgical outcome, failure to reattach hand. Beside it, in a woman's flowing script, something was scribbled, mother sent to MS. I shuddered at the thought of a 7-year-old losing a hand. But how had Charlie been admitted for leukemia and ended up having his hand severed? Also, who was MS on? Possibly Mariana. I flipped back 2 pages and found what I was looking for. Preparation notes. Clinician's 3rd attempt at attaching a child's severed appendage. Subject Charlie was mildly sedated with heroin hydrochloride and given a local anesthetic at the right wrist, fully conscious. M assisted with cleaver, severing the hand cleanly. Mother watched from the observation room. Not. I sat in shock as the realization crept in. I didn't want to believe it. I quickly scanned through the other files, but found similar accounts of gruesome reattachment surgeries, which confirmed what I already suspected. Mariana was cutting up children, and then Dr. Norwood was attempting to put them back together again. The girl with the missing eyes, the nursery rhyme, the room upstairs, even what Victor had said. It all made perfect sense now. Dr. Norwood seemed to be practicing his surgery skills on unsuspecting children who had been admitted for unrelated diseases or ailments. What I didn't understand was how he was getting away with it. Surely the parents didn't stand by and watch their children get cut into pieces by his psychotic nurse. There was more to this, I knew, and I wouldn't find it in these files. I shoved them away in disgust. Afterwards, the depression set in deeper and more fully. I still had a job to do, however, and that was protect the citizens of Mineral Wells, Texas. I tried to go about my usual work handling traffic accidents and other small crimes, the typical happenings of a small Texas town. At one point, I think I was hoping that I would forget what had happened and could return to just being a police officer. Maybe then I would feel normal, whole again. But as you obviously know by now, Mineral Wells had other plans for me. I heard one day about a young child from a prominent family in town who had suffered an accident while trying to operate a riding lawnmower, obviously without his parents' permission. The blade had mangled his left arm, all the way up to the elbow, and it ended up having to be amputated. It was reported as a terrible tragedy. I must have been the only one that noticed, based on my close review of the picture the local newspaper ran of the model of mower the child had been injured by, that the child's legs couldn't even reach the pedal. There was also the curious case of Brad Delaney, city council president and member of the First United Methodist Church, who one night took the .45 he had hidden under the mattress and killed his wife in cold blood while she slept. One shot, right to the temple. Brad confessed, saying it must have been him that shot her, seeing as how it was his gun and no one else had been in the house, but he didn't remember doing it. They had found him that morning, still asleep next to his murdered wife, the mattress stained in crimson red. One evening, I responded to a report of an awful smell coming from a student's room at Weatherford College Mineral Wells branch. The student had not been seen in several days, and based on the smell coming from the room, the administration did not want to enter the room themselves, fearing at best a dead body and at worst foul play. The college was located on the old site of Fort Wolters, which had been a military installation during World War II. I had run across Fort Wolters in the historical archives and knew a little about it. At one point during the war, it had been the largest infantry replacement training center in the United States, and several famous WW2E soldiers had been trained there. I had run across several accounts of a solider, apparently afraid of being sent off to war, who committed suicide in the barracks and could still be heard pacing the halls on the anniversary of his death. When I arrived, security led me to the student's room. As reported, the smell was foul and appeared to be that of a decomposing body. The security guard unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. That's when I saw him. In the middle of the room, hanging from a fan by a bedsheet, was the student. His face was bruised and swollen, and his eyes were bulging from his head, wide and red. A female student had passed by the room and screamed out, causing the security guard to frantically remove her from the vicinity, leaving me alone with the corpse. I looked around the room to find any signs of a struggle, but nothing else was amiss. That's when I called the investigative unit to take over. I found out several days later about something odd one of the investigative officers had found and couldn't explain. The entire room had been clean with no books, papers, or clothes out of place, except for a single folded piece of paper found under the desk. The officers had thought it would be a suicide note, but the words written inside didn't make any sense to them. They did to me. I cannot go to war. I'm sorry, Mother. Camp Wolters. Several weeks later, while at a coffee shop that I frequent, only bottled water, no coffee for me, I noticed a man several tables over staring at me. When I looked his way, he sort of flinched and acted like he had been looking somewhere else. I made a mental note of his appearance, 60-ish years old, dark-haired, and wearing some kind of uniform. He was holding a cup of coffee, and I could see that his hands were dirty and gnarled from manual labor. Not exactly the type of person who typically frequents a coffee shop. When I got up to leave, I could feel him watching me. Over the next several weeks, I saw the same man 3 more times, always far enough away to maintain his cover, but close enough to see what I was doing. I was pretty sure he was following me by that point, but honestly had no clue as to why. He seemed harmless enough, so I wasn't frightened, just curious. I got the feeling he was sizing me up, if that makes any sense. One day, I awoke to a note tucked into the side of my door. I opened it and read the hastily scribbled words, written on the back of a receipt from a local garage. Coffee shop, 3 p.m. I'll admit, I was a little nervous this person knew where I lived, although it shouldn't have been hard to follow me here. The coffee shop was a safe, public place, so I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't go. I'd never pictured myself as the type of person that would respond dutifully to the instructions written in shady notes stuffed into my doorframe. But the times, they were a-changing. And depression or not, It was time to get back to my investigation. I arrived at 3 to find my new friend seated in his usual spot. He saw me come in. A moment later, he was out of his seat and walking down the hallway at the back of the shop. I followed him, exiting out of the bad door the employees used for taking out the trash. He was standing there, lighting a cigarette, looking generally nervous and disheveled. "Want to tell me why you've been following me, Stan?" I started, probably sounding a bit more stern than I actually felt. I found that people tended to follow instructions better if you spoke to them by name, and the patch on his uniform had provided that information. I just had to be sure. Mary told me you two had talked, but I wanted to make sure you were okay for myself, he replied nervously. Mary Scott, I thought. He must be one of the others she had been talking about. Those that knew the truth about mineral wells. "And what did you find out by following me into a coffee shop?" I asked. "Well, for starters, all you drink is regular bottled water. No coffee or tap water. Also, I didn't find any of the crazy water bottles outside in the trash at your apartment." A creepy touche, I thought. This guy was smarter than he looked. "So what am I doing here?" I said. He threw down a cigarette. "Mary said you knew what was going on in mineral wells. Said you may be trying to do something about it." I wasn't sure I trusted him at this point, and he could see it on my face. "Oh, don't worry. I don't drink it either. I've never touched the stuff. My father made sure I understood that." "Who was your father?" "He was an orderly at the old Millings sanitarium. That damned place." "I know of it," I said coldly. "I thought you should know what he told me about that place." He paused for a minute, then went on. He said it was the scariest place he ever stepped foot in. He helped with patients, administered medicine, and cleaned the rooms, so he was familiar with the goings-on. He told me about the different types of treatments they would perform on the patients there. Electroshock therapy, experimental surgeries, psychological experiments, sleep deprivation studies, even waterboarding. The screams were the worst part, he said. "I know, they aren't exactly the type of bedtime stories you should tell your children, but I don't think he could help himself. He couldn't sleep for most of his adult life, and my mother died when I was young. The place was hellish," he said, "but they always had an influx of new patients, regardless of how bad it was." And did he say anything about where all the patients came from? He pieced it together. When news got out about the mineral water, people came from far and wide to be treated. Bathhouses and spas were some of the main attractions for those with less serious ailments of the body. But Millings promised a cure for every dementia. "Worm in the peach tree," I repeated. I hadn't had that turn of phrase before. Oh, it was just something my dad used to say. It basically means someone is taking advantage of a situation. "There were also backroom deals with some of the other businesses in town," he went on. "I think the Baker management would refer people to Millings, as most of the out-of-towners ended up there first. I also know that Dr. Norwood would sometimes send patients their way. My dad was always the most curious about those patients," he said, "because they always..." It suddenly got cold and dark where we were standing. I looked up to see the thunderheads rolling in. We'd have some weather tonight. I changed the subject. "How do you know Mary? And what is her part in all of this?" He looked like he was about to respond, then thought better of it. "You'll have to ask her about that one." The bitter, biting rain that began to fall cut off any further conversation between us. Early the next day, after my shift the previous night, I pulled out the files again. I had a hunch about something Stan had said. Plus, the middle of a thunderstorm is always the perfect time to read about sadistic shit. I found Charlie's file and flipped to the page I was looking for. I found the hastily scribbled words again. "Mother sent to MS." It wasn't a person. It was a place. Millings Sanitarium. Dr. Norwood had been sending the perfectly healthy parents of the children he was experimenting on to be experimented on themselves. I looked back through the children's files, and my other hunch was confirmed. All of the children were from out of town. South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Tennessee. I finally got it. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s. There's no television, social media, or cell phones. People keep in touch through letters, for Christ's sake. Your child is terminally ill with cancer or some other illness, or perhaps it's you that's sick and you've lost all hope until you hear about Mineral Wells, Texas, home of the crazy water that heals all that ails you. You'll try anything. You pack up your bags and make the long journey to Texas. Once you're there, you'll try anything, and you're never heard from again. For it to work, the families would need to be from anywhere but Texas. Check. You'd need a network of conspirators to make sure all loose ends were tied up. Check. Dr. Norwood got the children and Millings got the parents or anyone else from the baker who was dealing with a psychological infirmity. If anyone ever tracked you down at Millings, which would be nearly impossible, who would believe your crazy stories? By that time, you'd be so drugged, emotionally scarred, or both. No one would dream of interrupting your treatment. Could law enforcement have been involved as well? The scope of it blew my mind. Think of all of the suffering and death. Think of those poor children. All because of some foul-smelling water, the hope-filled human spirit, and a group of doctors more sadistic than any you could ever imagine. Worms in the peach tree. Story 2. I stayed in bed for the next 3 days. I had to call in sick to work, which was fine because I very rarely miss my shifts, but I wouldn't have cared either way. I was even deeper within the dullness now, like there was several inches of something between myself and the world. I could barely breathe through it. When I would get up for food or to use the restroom, I felt more like a marionettist pulling the corresponding string for each body part than like myself. I wondered why I was the one paying for all of the suffering that I had discovered. On the 4th day, I willed myself out of bed. I got dressed, put my gear on, and headed out the door. I had somewhere to be. The 20-minute drive to Weatherford, TX, definitely improved my mood a bit. The stark scenery, flat land, and trees is calming sometimes. The Mineral Wells Public Library was closed indefinitely for repairs. Some issue with the contractors who were supposed to fix the roof, so the annual Mineral Wells Day presentation had been moved to Weatherford's Public Library. Our precinct likes its officers to participate in community events as much as possible, and this year was my turn to attend. The presentation concentrated on the wreck history of Mineral Wells and the brave leaders that built it from a one-well town to a booming resort community. The irony did not escape me. J.A. Lynch was the ultimate hero of the day, but I knew otherwise. I sat in the back and listened off and on, but was mostly lost in my own thoughts. When it concluded, I stepped outside to speak briefly to one of the presenters to thank them for their support of our community outreach program, but a familiar face was already speaking to her. It was Mary Scott. I should have known I would see her here. We exchanged glances when she was done, and a moment later she walked over to me and spoke. "You look like hell, dear," she said matter-of-factly. Oh, the honesty of Southern women. She could obviously tell something was wrong. Appreciate that. I joked. A little levity never hurt anyone. "Mary, I found the files in the basement at the hospital. Dr. Norwood and his nurse were performing experiments on young children and sending the parents over to Millings Sanitarium to get rid of the witnesses." Mary looked at me intently. "I know," she said. A dagger shoved into my gut wouldn't have done any more damage than her words had. So I had risked my life and sanity in that basement for what? Some sick game she was playing? She looked around to see if anyone was listening, then motioned for me to follow her around the corner of the building. I had a mind to walk off, but followed against my better judgment. Only half of me hoped you'd find them. The other half, well, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I had my reasons. There are, she paused, trying to find the right word, consequences for talking about the events of Mineral Wells past from the lip. She stopped and pulled up the sleeve on the shirt she was wearing. I saw 2 long lengthwise cuts that went from her wrist almost to her elbow, almost healed. They were just deep enough to bleed and scar, but not deep enough to hit any major veins. I did them myself, 2 days after our conversation, but I don't remember doing it. A warning, I suppose. From whom? I said, feeling the guilt rising inside me. I had gone from being angry at her to feeling sorry for her that quickly. My emotions were very unstable as of late. She hesitated briefly like Stan had, then continued. Did those files mention Dr. Norwood's nurse? Mariana, I answered. She was my grandmother. The realization hit me like a bombshell. No wonder she didn't want to tell me. It also explained how she knew about the files and everything else. She went on. She came to Mineral Wells in 1910 seeking treatment for her mental disorder. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but my mother said she heard voices. Mariana was only 24 then. I guess Dr. Norwood thought he could use her. She had my mother released 6 years later. She paused again. I'm sorry, Mary. You don't have to tell me all this. It's too dangerous. My voice cracked. Yes, I do. It's time the truth came out. Growing up, you always think your parents are perfect. After you get a little older, you start to notice things about them. My mother was missing several fingers on her right and left hands. She was starting to cry. By her own mother? I asked, incredulous. Yes, which is how I know the same could happen to me. I saw my grandmother in my dreams the night I got these scars. I heard the bell, which meant it was time for one of the children to go with Mariana. It was my turn. She was now sobbing. I put my arms around her. The past is never dead, I thought. She wiped her eyes. Why my mother named me after her I'll never understand, but perhaps she didn't either. She pulled away, then turned back around. There's one last thing. I tried to tell you this the last time we spoke. You need to go see Madame Teresa. She's here in Weatherford and does psychic readings. Pay no mind to the surface of what you see. That's only for the tourists. Teresa is an old soul. She should be able to help you. Anyway, I almost balked, but thought better of it. If I had seen and heard the dead with my own eyes and ears, it wasn't a huge leap to believe that someone else could speak to them. Thank you, I'll do it. I agreed. I hope she can help you the rest of the way. I have given you all I can. She looked like she meant it. It wasn't hard to find Miss Teresa. She was, after all, the only local business with a sign that bore the image of 2 hands holding a crystal ball, even if she was located several miles from the city limits. I still had my doubts, but I had no other option at this point. The small shop had seen better days. The carpet was purple and faded, and beads and other baubles hung from the low ceiling haphazardly. The smell of eucalyptus and cinnamon filled the air, covering the smell of the cats that tramped around the room, for the most part at least. The sign inside said by appointment only, but I hoped she already knew I was coming. I took a seat as at the large, ornately carved wooden table in the center of the room. That's when a woman appeared from behind the curtain in front of me. She wore a long dress, rough spun and voluminous, with a hood on the back. She was dark-haired, and her wrinkled, sagging skin was the same. I could not see her eyes. She wore a mask over them, but instead of eye holes, the mask was solid, with eyes finely painted in their correct places. It was supremely unnerving, like looking at a life-size doll that had come to life. Mary sent me, was all I could muster. I see, she replied. Come with me. And with that, she disappeared behind the curtain again. I slowly got up and followed her back. The room behind the curtain was much smaller than the main room, with only a small, simple wooden table in the middle. In the 4 corners of the room were small painted statues depicting animals, totems I believe they are called. A goose, a mountain lion, a hummingbird, and a gopher. I recognized the eyes. They were the same that had been painted on Teresa's mask. She was already seated at the table, so I sat down across from her. I noticed her hands were as wrinkled and weathered as I had ever seen, but gentle, somehow. I tried to focus on them. Looking at her face scared me, frankly. I sensed that she could feel my discomfort. We didn't have to speak about Mary or my purpose here. It was clear she understood. Can you speak to the dead? I managed to squeak out. Hey, I have spoken to them. Dead, you say? There is no death. There is only a change of worlds. That is what my people believe. Her voice rolled slowly and rhythmically, like a train rolling over its tracks. Why are they in Mineral Wells? And why are they tormenting the living? When man leaves this world, he passes into the spirit realm. Spirits are always around us, but the dead are not powerless. They can be incited to violence, just as man can. Mineral wells and the water it is named after are cursed, but the exact source of this curse is hidden to me. I do have my guesses, though. In Pueblo mythology, there is a spirit known as Pishuni. I believe it is similar to the spirit depicted in the Christian Bible who appears as a snake in the Garden of Eden. Pishuni is known as an interloper. His purpose is to create strife. It was he who tempted the first humans and disrupted their harmony with nature. I believe whomever first coaxed the mineral-rich water from the depths of the earth may have been visited by Pishuni. A deal may have been struck. The water would bring great wealth, but there would be a price. When the first men used the water to deceive those who honestly sought it, the price was exacted. The water was cursed, and all those who died in mineral wells while seeking the water would remain to exact their own vengeance against the ancestors of those who brought about their deaths. If it wasn't Pishuni, it may have been some other earth demon. In the end, it is of no consequence. It was ultimately man's lust for power and unsatiable greed cursed mineral wells. Unman. I replayed all of the strange events I had encountered during my time in mineral wells in my mind. Virginia Brown, James' great-grandmother, Mariana, the man at the VA, and even the children, all had come to mineral wells seeking treatment for something. There were others that I was unsure of, like the spirits involved in the Fort Wolters suicide, Brad Delaney's murder of his wife, and the lawnmower accident, but I had a hunch those spirits had done the same. If I wasn't truly numb before, I was now. My eyes seemed to roll in my head. I'm not sure if I passed out, but all of a sudden Teresa's hands were on mine. "There is a dark cloud over you. You must be careful," she said cryptically. I looked around the room trying to concentrate on something, and my eyes locked on the gopher totem. Although she couldn't see me, she knew. The totems, yes, they are for protection. My people believe that spirit animals can guard man from evil. They guard this room, one for water, one for mountain, one for air, and one for air. Then one for air, and one for earth. The gopher guards the ground. Hopefully, but your eyes. I started not thinking clearly. I can see better without them. I slowly regained my composure and stood up shakily. Teresa put her arms around me and guided me into the main room. As I was about to leave, she spoke again. "There is something else. I hesitate to say this to you in your condition, but I must. You have a friend in grave danger. She..." I was already out the door, stumbling to my squad car. I arrived at Mary's house about 15 minutes later. It was evening, and the sun was creeping behind the horizon, painting the sky with multicolored hues of lavender and red. I didn't notice any of her dogs running about as I pulled up with my lights on and sirens blasting, neglecting to turn them off as I exited the vehicle. I drew my weapon instinctively, even though it had little chance of protecting me or Mary from an evil spirit. I slowly crept toward the door and found it unlocked. I was barely seeing clearly at this point, but found my way inside. My boots squished on the floor of the living room. I looked down to find the carpet soaked with so much blood that it had created a standing puddle, one that I was forced to walk through rather than around. This went against every bit of my training, but I was not thinking clearly at the time. The dullness had almost overcome me. It was then I noticed there were body parts floating in the sea of red. A tongue, a foot, ow, an eye. I retched once, then again. In a daze, I followed the trail of blood through the living room and into the kitchen. It was worse there. The entire floor was red, and there were more body parts. Pieces of flesh and bone may be more accurate. It was hard to make out anything among the gore. The smell of death permeated the air. Or was that only my fear? Through my tears, I found my way through the kitchen and around the small island in the center. It was there I found Mary, or what was left of her, slumped against the far cabinets. Her face wasn't hers anymore. It seemed to me like some professionally done movie prop. Her nose had been sliced cleanly off, and there were 2 bloody holes where his eyes had been. I wished I had Teresa's mask to cover them up. Maybe then she could see again like Teresa. The truth finally sank in. This was all my fault. I had dragged Mary into this, and she had lost her life helping me. I had killed her. My knees collapsed, and I sank into the grime. My hand landed on something cold and slippery that appeared to have fallen from Mary's hand. A large kitchen cleaver. Story 6. They found me, covered in gore and vomit right where I had collapsed. The neighbors had gotten tired of the constantly blaring sirens and called the police. James was there, along with several other officers. Jesus Christ, man, it's a bloodbath in here. What happened? He asked incredulously. It was too late. I tried to stop it. I whispered as he pulled me up onto my feet. Who did this? It was... But I couldn't put the words together. What could I say? Is any of this your blood? Are you hurt? No, fine. I'm not fine, I thought. In minutes, the whole team was there, rolling out the yellow tape, photographing everything, and collecting evidence. In a small town like Mineral Wells, you won't see everyone in hazmat suits dusting things for fingerprints and setting up lasers that show the trajectory of bullets and such. The investigators do mostly everything, and they do it really well most of the time. Although I would have hated to be the guy that had to collect all of those body parts. My clothes, shoes, and the rest of the gear I was wearing were collected in clear plastic bags. I was photographed from head to toe, and blood swabs were taken. Because I was an officer, I was allowed to go home and shower before heading up to the precinct to give my statement. I know that any other civilian would have been arrested on the spot. I arrived at the precinct showered and clean-shaven, my black satchel on my shoulder. I was taken back to the room where we interview criminals, asked to sit, and offered a cup of coffee. I politely declined. We have a little camcorder that is set up in the corner that was switched on after the tedious process of deleting some old interviews. I was nervous at that point. Shouldn't I be meeting with a superior to simply give my statement? Instead, I was read my Miranda rights. I decided to decline my right to have an attorney present while I was questioned. I had nothing to hide. Looking back now, I realize that was my first mistake, but considering the almost catatonic emotional state I had been in for some time, logic and reason had deserted me and the fire inside me. The one inside all of us that urges us to fight at all costs had been all but I told my story from beginning to end. The possessions, the experiments, and even what Teresa said. All of it. It had to come out. I showed them the files as proof. I pleaded with my fellow officers to stop drinking the water and to start looking into the strange occurrences in Mineral Wells. I begged them to help me shut down the company bottling and shipping this cursed water across the country. They played along, maybe just to keep me talking. But the looks I got when I explained Mary had mutilated herself, well, let's just say they weren't friendly. I'm sure you can imagine how it went. Why were you at her home that night? A psychic told me she was in danger. Officer rolls eyes and scoffs. Sure, buddy, we believe you. Now tell us about these ghosts you saw again. Afterwards, I was placed on temporary leave and taken to a holding cell. The next several weeks were a blur. I was placed under official arrest soon after my interview and held without bond. Can you blame them? It was a gruesome scene. I was covered in blood. It appeared as if I had handled the murder weapon, and hell, she was cut into pieces for Christ's sake. The medical examiner stated that no human would have been able to survive long enough to do that to themselves without bleeding out. Plus, even if she could have, why would Mary have done this to herself? It made no sense. I learned later that my arrest was never reported, but I wasn't surprised. Can you imagine how local cop arrested for mutilation of retired teacher would have gone over in the local paper? The MWPD would have had to deal with a shitstorm the likes of which they had never experienced before. Controversies like that don't go away very easily, if ever, in small towns like Mineral Wells. Luckily, the grand jury was meeting that month, so I didn't have long to wait. My case was fast-tracked and quickly presented. To no one's surprise, the grand jury returned a true bill. I was indicted for murder under Texas Penal Code 19.02. It can carry up to life in prison. As you can imagine, getting indicted for murder for a crime you didn't commit is a crushing feeling. What's worse is that I knew I had no chance to convince anyone that I was innocent. The MWPD had the files, which didn't really prove anything anyway, but I knew they would never see the light of day again. Even if Stan and Teresa could have come forward with some other credible evidence, there is no way they would be to be believed. The veil would prevent it, so I sat alone in my cell, mostly crying, often sleeping, receding deeper into the dullness, pretending this was all a dream. I slept in restless fits, racked by night terrors. At this point, my friends, I have to make a confession. This will be my first of 2 confessions, and is in fact the only thing I am guilty of. I have deceived you. I am no longer a police officer in Texas, as the title of this post suggests, although you may have guessed that already. I apologize for this sincerely. If I had told you my current and true situation up front, it's likely you wouldn't have listened to my story. I needed you to believe me. One of the foundations of the criminal justice system in this country is that to be found guilty of an offense, you have to have had a rational understanding of what you were doing at the time. After a hearing, motioned for by my attorney, the court found that I was in fact not competent to stand trial for what I had done. He presented evidence of erratic behavior from the time I had arrived in Mineral Wells up through the night of the murder. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't. I'm almost positive my attorney personally thought I was guilty and mentally sound, but he successfully painted the picture of a stressed-out cop who had simply snapped. This was perfect for the district attorney's office and the MWPD. There would be no public trial. No one would find out about the psychopathic officer who cut an innocent woman into pieces. Texas, like other states, provides for a different type of punishment for people who fall into this category, which brings me to my second confession. I am currently confined in a secure mental facility serving a 40-year term of commitment for a crime I did not commit. I only have access to my phone every couple of days and at certain times, which is why I've had to break up these posts into multiple parts. You may be surprised I have access to it at all, but you shouldn't be. Inmates smuggling cell phones into prison is an enormous problem in today's justice system. The problem is, the guards are all in on it. They make a little money by helping the inmate or looking the other way, and of course deny everything if the inmate is caught. It hadn't taken much money to bribe my orderly into letting me use mine on occasion. I had plenty saved, considering I was single, had no social life, and never ate or drank out. I was able to contact Stan through his garage and have him deliver the money for me. He got a small cut too. Human greed, right? I'm also sorry that this may not have ended how you hope. I think Hollywood movies have conditioned us to believe conflicts always resolve tidily, often to the benefit of the protagonists. If you just believe, or strive hard enough, or fight long enough, you'll win. They have to, or otherwise people wouldn't continue to watch them. That's a good thing for the most part. There will be no happy ending here. Unfortunately, life isn't always like that. It's dark, gruesome, and unfair more often than we'd like to admit, and we have to live with the scars. There will be no justice for Mary, those children, or any of the victims in Mineral Wells, Texas. There will certainly be no justice for me. I fell victim to something even more sinister than the curse. Hope. The idea that we can change things, that we can make the wrong right again. I was wrong about the nature of the world, and it cost me everything. One previous commenter described the hopelessness and despair the parents must have felt when they were sent to Millings Sanitarium after watching their children scream in agony on that operating table. That's the feeling that haunts me now. The meds I am administered every day at 9 and 3 help some. I'm numb mostly, and I can sleep. I wouldn't have been able to live with the night terrors. Shudder. Thankfully, the dullness has mostly faded away. I see it's time for me to go. I must leave you, dear reader, this time for good. It's time for one of my treatments. Yes, I have those too. Some traditional and some experimental. But they will have to be tales for another day. I've actually gotten used to the screams here, even though they echo in my dreams. The end.